Hello everybody and welcome back to another video by Funlearn Tutorials. In the last video we had talked about consumer surplus, and in today's video we'll be talking about producer surplus, which is the other side of the coin. So we'll be talking about producer surplus. It's essentially just the reverse of consumer surplus. So just to save time, I have already drawn the diagram that I had discussed in the last video. So we have the horizontal quantity axis and we have the vertical price axis, and essentially what we have is we have the same upward rising demand curve, the upward rising supply curve and the downward sloping demand curve. We have the equilibrium price P star, we have the equilibrium quantity Q star, that's the supply curve, and we have the equilibrium quantity Q star, and we have the upward rising supply curve and the downward sloping demand curve, or the downward sloping demand curve. Let me just mark them as red so it will be easier to determine which is the demand and supply curves. So this is the standard diagram, the demand supply model that we have. Now last class we decided on the perspective of the consumer. Today, since we are talking about producer surplus, we'll be looking at the decision making of the producer. So what would the relevant curve be? We would be looking at the supply side. Now think of it this way. If I have, so if this is the supply curve, let me just extend it so that it's easier. Now for a supplier, if the supplier is willing to supply Q1, he would be expecting to receive price P1. If he were to supply quantity Q2, he would be expecting a price P2. Similarly, so on and so forth, if he were to supply a quantity Q3, he would be expecting a price P3. This is the standard supply law of supply, where as the quantity of supply increases, the price increases. Now, if the quantity at the end of the day, when the market is in equilibrium, the producer ends up supplying Q star and ends up receiving P star for each unit of commodity that he supplies. However, the thing is that for the first unit, so if I think of it this way, for the first unit, if he were to expect 1 rupee, for the second unit, if he were to expect 2 rupee, for the third unit, if he were to expect 3 rupee, at the end of the day, he sells 4 commodities, 4 units of the commodity, and he ends up receiving 4 units for each commodity. So the thing is, he was actually expecting 1 rupee from the first commodity, but he ends up getting 4 rupee. From the second commodity, he was expecting 2 rupees, but he ends up again getting 4 rupee. Similarly, for the third unit, he was expecting only 3 rupees, whereas he ends up getting 4 rupee. Essentially, he was just expecting this area. So he was expecting to receive just the area under the curve as the payment for the quantities that he supplied. But he ends up receiving more because the entire market operates at the price P star and not at these individual prices. So he ends up gaining all these portions. These portions were not in his expectations. He was not exactly expecting to receive all this, but since the market is operating at equilibrium, he ends up receiving all this. So this part is called his producer surplus, because this part was not expected by the producer. It's his surplus. He ends up gaining all this part. Now this is the pictographic or the diagrammatic way of representing the producer surplus. Now if I think of this point, suppose let me just mark this point as X. So how do we represent the producer surplus mathematically? So if I think of area under the curve, the area under the curve would be represented as such. So I would be taking the area, if this is origin O, I would be thinking of producer surplus as the total area O P star E star, O P star E Q star. That would be the total square, the entire rectangle area, minus the area under the curve. So minus the area under the supply curve this time, and the limit will be 0 to Q star. The limit will be 0 to Q star. So you can note the difference with the consumer surplus. The difference is that in consumer surplus, the area term came before the rectangle term. Here the area term comes after. In the consumer surplus, we were looking at the demand curve. In this, we are looking at the supply curve. And other than that, the entire concept remains the same. That's the area way. The other way would be to look at the triangle. So the triangle area think of it in this way. So we can represent the producer surplus also as the area of the triangle X P star E. X P star E. So we can think of it as the area X P star E. X P star E. So that would be my producer surplus. Again, if we were to think of it in the same way as the consumer surplus, we would think of it as the area under the supply curve. Since we are looking at the producer surplus, that is the decision making of the producers or the sellers, we will be looking at the supply curve. So that is essentially the producer surplus, and this way we can think of consumer surplus and producer surplus in market equilibrium.